All right, so front side was 2019. And the first answer that I want to look at with you is this one right here. The student said the treatments were the varying concentrations of fungus mixtures, 0 milliliters per liter, 1.25, 2.5, and 3.75. The experimental units were the insects sprayed with one of the 4 mixtures. The response variable was the number of insects still alive in the container 1 week after spraying. Does the experiment have a control group? Yes, the experiment has a control group. One of the groups receives a fungus mixture concentration of 0 milliliters per liter. It goes through the experiment, yet it does not receive a treatment, and the number of insects alive from this control group will work as a base for comparison. And then their answer to part C was each of the 20 containers are numbered 1 to 20 using a random number generator. Generate 5 numbers within this range, 1 to 20. Make sure there are no repetitions in the numbers. The first 5 numbers correspond to the containers being assigned to the first fungus mixture, 0 milliliters per liter. Generate another set of 5 numbers. Remember, you can't repeat the number from the last set of 5 because they've already been assigned to the first mixture. This set of 5 numbers will correspond to the containers being assigned to the second mixture, 1.25 milliliters per liter. Repeat this process for the 2.5 mixture and the 3.75 mixture. All 4 mixtures should have 5 containers each. So I want to go through it a piece at a time. On part A, what did they get correct? What did they get correct on part A? The treatments, okay. Did they get the experimental units correct? No. It's the containers. The containers are what are being assigned to these groups, so those would be the experimental units. So they did not get the experimental units part correct. What about the response variable? Did they do okay with that? Yes. So treatments they got correct. They labeled this in 2 different ways, so they really covered their bases. They said that it was the varying concentration in fungus mixtures, and then they also listed them out. So only one of those 2 would be required, but they got like 2 different ways of saying, yes, these are our treatments. And then, like we said, experimental units was not correct. They got a partially correct on this first part because of getting experimental units incorrect. How do we feel about part B? So I'm curious here. I agree that there is a control group. It says one of the groups receives a fungus mixture concentration of 0 milliliters per liter. Is it therefore receiving a treatment? Yes. Yes. Not being sprayed with a mixture is one of the identified treatment conditions. Right up here, they identified the treatments. 0 milliliters per liter was one of the potential treatments. Treatment does not necessarily mean that you have to do something to it. Sometimes the treatment is that you just leave it alone. So on part B, they actually, with the way they worded it here, they contradicted themselves. They said they received this concentration, but then they said that they did not receive a treatment. So that would be a contradiction right there. They received a partially correct on this section. What do we think about their experimental design? Yes, they did a very good job here with their experimental design. They not only stated exactly how they would use randomization, they made sure that each group would have 5. One of the things I really liked about this is that they made sure to mention no repetitions, and that when they're assigning the other numbers, they have to make sure to not repeat any of these numbers from up here, making sure that every single group has 5 containers in it. This particular student, because they got a partially correct on the first part, a partially correct on the second part, and an essentially correct here, they got a 2 out of 4 on this particular question. Let's go compare that to the next student. All right. So we'll go a piece at a time since we've already kind of looked at the question as a whole on the last student. We'll just see what we think, whether it's essentially correct, partially correct, or incorrect. Treatments are 0 milliliters per liter, 1.25, 2.5, and 3.75 fungus mixtures. How do we feel about treatments? Yes. Experimental units are the groups of insects in each container. What do we think? Why or why not?
It's on the groups of insects, not the actual container.
Well, what's inside the containers? The insects. I would say that this is essentially correct right here. It's the containers that are being assigned to the groups. The containers are full of insects, but they did make sure to include this particular piece right here. So I would count this as essentially correct. It's not the thing that you want to watch out for is it's not the individual insects that are being assigned to these groups. If it was individual bugs being placed and randomly assigned to these treatment conditions, then we would call those our experimental units. Since they've been grouped into containers, and it's the containers that we are assigning, and we're treating it as one entity, we're going to count that as our experimental units. But inside it, it does contain insects, so it's not incorrect to state that it's there. But leaving this part off would make it incorrect, leaving the fact that they're all in the same container. Response variables, the number of insects alive in each container 1 week after spraying. Yes. Overall, on the first part, this student received an essentially correct. Does the experiment have a control group? Yes, the experiment has a control group. The control group are the containers that are sprayed with 0 milliliters of fungus mixture concentration. What do we think? What did they get wrong? Is it incorrect to say that? They didn't explain why. Did they have to explain why or just explain that it was a control group? That it was a control group. So they had to identify. So just here with the explain part, they're saying, because the first question is just a yes or no. So you have to give a yes or no here. Yes, there is a control group, or no, it's not. And then explaining your answer, they explained by stating which group was the control group. They didn't have to go into detail about why it was the control group necessarily, just which group is identified as the control group here. It would not have been incorrect to expound on that, but as we saw in the previous student's example, when they said it's because they received no treatment, that's what knocked them down to a partially correct. One of the treatment conditions is to get a spray that has no fungus in it. Does that make sense? This was scored as essentially correct here. All right, let's look at their design. First, write out numbers 1. I think that's supposed to say 1 to 5. 1 on 5 sheets of paper. Write got it. Write number 1 on 5 sheets of paper. Write number 2 on another 5 sheets of paper. Write number 3 on another 5 and number 4 on another. So they're using 20 sheets of paper. We've got 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, kind of like names in a hat type situation, although they haven't described what they're doing with it yet. Place the total of 20 sheets of paper in a hat, and for each container, take out a piece of paper. If you take out a sheet that has a 1 on it, it'll receive the 0 milliliters per liter concentration of fungus mixture. If it has a 2 on it, it will be in the 1.25 milliliter. A 3 will be the 2.5 milliliter, and a 4 will be the 3.75 milliliter. Do not place the sheets of paper back into the hat once it has been taken out. What do we think? It did say no repeats. What's really important in this stage when we're doing this assignment? Don't put the sheets back into the hat, which they did mention. What else is really important? Making sure that it's a random assignment. If I have you guys come and turn in papers up here, and then I just start grabbing them off the top, is that a random assignment? What would I have to do to make sure it's a random assignment? Have to make sure to mix them up. Did they say anything about mixing them up? No. Because they left out that piece, because they left out any language talking about what they're going to do to randomize it, they only received a partially correct on this. I don't think that this is a bad design overall, but they did not establish one of the key components here, which is randomization. So if they had just added a couple words of, reach your hand in and mix them up, then it would have been essentially correct. They got a partially correct here because they did not hit that piece, and so overall they received a 3 on this question. How are we doing so far? Reasonably okay? Okay. I want to make sure that we're focusing kind of on the big key components because there's lots of extra language we can add to things, although sometimes we have to be careful with that extra language because it'll show some gaps in our understanding, and that'll knock it down from essentially correct to partially correct. Make sure to answer the question completely, but expounding on it any further could possibly hit you. All right, last one on this side. 4 different mixtures with different concentrations of fungus, and then they even listed them out, 1, 2, 3, 4. How do we feel about treatments? Yes. 20 containers with a certain number of insects. Are those our experimental units? Yes. Response variable, number of insects still alive in the container 1 week after spraying. Yes. Essentially correct on part 1 here. Does the experiment have a control group? Explain your answer. Yes, the experiment has a control group. One of the mixtures that is a possible treatment has 0 milliliters per liter of fungus in it, or in other words, no fungus. So that mixture would allow for the comparison of having fungus versus the default mixture, which has no fungus. What do you guys think? Did they answer the yes-no part? We'll start there. Did they answer that part correctly? Did they identify which group would be the control group? Did they identify that it's still receiving a treatment? Yes. The extra information that they added in, is it correct or incorrect? Correct. They went on to talk about why you would have a control group, that it's for comparison purposes. The treatment is that received no fungus, and so we're going to compare what happens when it has no fungus to the other 3 groups that are all getting different concentrations of fungus. So this is essentially correct right here. All right, you could number the containers from 1 to 20, with each container getting a unique number. Then put those numbers onto slips of paper, put them in a hat, draw a slip out and record the number without placing it back in the hat. Repeat this process 4 more times. Those containers that correspond to the recorded numbers are assigned to mixture 1. Draw 5 more slips without replacing them. Those corresponding containers are assigned to mixture 2. Repeat this process twice more and assign the corresponding containers to mixture 3. What do you think? They didn't say anything about randomization. So it's funny because here, as I'm reading the justification of the readers, it says that they included language about mixing it up. I don't see that particular language in here. I see about putting them in a hat, but I don't see anything about mixing it up and randomizing it. So while the readers' comments state that they got an essentially correct on this, I don't see the same language that they're referring. So I would give this a partially correct, which would mean I would assign this overall a score of 3. If they had that language about mixing it up and randomization, then it would receive a 4. Yes, ma'am?
Isn't it kind of randomizing, though? Like, if they're just sticking their hand in and they don't know which one they're picking up, though?
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, and maybe that's what the reader was identifying. I think possibly what they're counting as when they're talking about mixing them up is because they have the numbers 1 through 20 and they're reaching their hand in the hat, but again, they don't actually state that they're mixing it up. I would just make sure to add that little bit of language in there. So adding language to make sure that you're talking about randomization. So how do you guys feel overall about this one? Like your answers versus the model answers. Big important pieces here. Make sure when we're talking about explanatory variable that you're listing out all of the possible conditions there, that it's not just a single word, it's not just fungus. The explanatory variable contains all of those different treatment conditions, which they had 4 of. One of the things that has come up a couple times, and I know it's on the review, it's been in the homework as well, is when we talk about factors, which we didn't really talk about in the notes much. Factors would be, like I would say, fungus would be the factor here. But then the explanatory variable or the actual treatments themselves, I'm breaking it down into listing all of the possibilities. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. The next one. This was from 2016. Where did it go? All right. It decided to pop back up over here. So we're on the back side of your paper now. There we go. I don't know why it went over to the other screen. Alzheimer's disease results in a loss of cognitive ability beyond what is expected with typical aging. A local newspaper published an article with the following headline: Study finds strong association between smoking and Alzheimer's. The article reported that a study tracked the medical histories of 21,123 men and women for 23 years. That's a lot of 23s. The article stated that for those who smoked at least 2 packs of cigarettes a day, the risk of developing Alzheimer's was 2.57 times the risk for those who did not smoke. Explanatory variable, smoking versus not smoking. You think that that is essentially correct? Response variable, development of Alzheimer's disease. I'm seeing a no. Tell me why. I like that. So if there's a risk associated with it, what are kind of the 2 possible outcomes here? Developing Alzheimer's versus not developing Alzheimer's. So they gave both conditions up here for the explanatory, smoking versus not smoking. Our response variable also has 2 conditions, developing or not developing. So they correctly identified the explanatory variable. They did not correctly fully identify the explanatory variable, so that got a partially correct. Is the study described in the article an observational study or an experiment? And they said observational study because the researcher did not apply any treatment. Instead, they watched and took data from subjects from 2 different groups. Since neither group received any form of treatment, this was not an experiment. What do you think? I like that. Correctly identifies it as observational. If it had been an experiment, what would the treatments have been? Smoking versus non-smoking. So as I'm looking at the reader's notes on this one, it said it does not explain that the treatments would have been levels of the explanatory variable or levels of smoking status. Because the levels of the explanatory variable are not identified in the context as the potential treatments, they received a partially correct here. So we know it's an observational study because treatments were not assigned. The treatments, had it been an experiment, would have been smoking and not smoking. I want to kind of pause right here and ask a question that was not on here. Would it be ethical to conduct this as an experiment?
No.
Why not?
Because Alzheimer's disease is a very messy disease.
Alzheimer's disease is very messy. We also know at this point that smoking carries many other risks associated with it. And if someone is involved in a study and they are assigned to the smoking group, they would be required to participate in something that we now know is very dangerous. So an observational study is really the only ethical way to go about looking at something like this. But I think that's kind of why they were wanting to see that language about what the treatment groups would have been, because at that point you can say, well, this has to be an observational study. Exercise status, regular weekly exercise versus no regular weekly exercise, was mentioned in the article as a possible confounding variable. Explain how exercise status could be a confounding variable in the study. They said it's impossible to determine which members of each group performed weekly exercise. It's also impossible to determine whether weekly exercise either deterred the development of Alzheimer's or exacerbated it. This means that the development of the disease could be affected by either smoking or exercise, and the researchers do not know which affected the results. What do you think?
It didn't really explain how it could be a confounding variable.
I like that. So when you think about confounding variables are going to have a relationship to both the explanatory and the response variable. They explained the possible relationship between exercise and Alzheimer's. Did they talk about the possible relationship between exercise and smoking status? No. That would be a really important piece. If you're identifying something as a confounding variable, it needs to have relationships to both of these things. And so they established one but not the other. This received a partially correct on part C. So they received an overall score of 2. They got partially corrects on all 3 sections. Let's go look at somebody who got a slightly better score. All right, explanatory variable. The explanatory variable is whether or not the women and men involved smoked at least 2 packs of cigarettes a day or not. The response variable is developing Alzheimer's disease. What do we think about their explanatory and response variables? Did they do okay with the explanatory? What about the response? What's missing from this? I'm sorry, what? Yeah, so we've got the response variable is developing this, with the alternate not being stated. So Alzheimer's tends to be one of those things that, while we know that there's different stages of progression in the disease, it is one of those things that you either do get diagnosed with or you do not get diagnosed with. And so you would need to make sure to state those 2 conditions there. Anytime we're talking about explanatory and response, we want to know all the possible treatments here, all the possible conditions, and all the possible conditions in our response. So they got a partially correct up here. The study described in the article is an observational study because treatments were not assigned to the men and women involved in the study. In other words, an experiment did not randomly select individuals to smoke at least 2 packs of cigarettes a day. The participants either already smoked that much or didn't. Yes, this received an essentially correct. They talked very specifically about what it would look like had it been an experiment, what the treatments would have been, and then stated that the researchers did not randomly assign people to those conditions. Exercise status could be a confounding variable in the study because exercise could be linked to a lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. In addition, individuals who exercise regularly may be more concerned with their health and therefore less likely to smoke. The strong association between smoking and Alzheimer's could not be accurate if more people in the non-smoking category exercised regularly. Yes, essentially correct on this part as well. So they received a score of 3 out of 4 on this question. And last one here. The explanatory variable was whether or not the individual smoked at least 2 packs of cigarettes a day. The response variable was whether or not the individual developed Alzheimer's disease. Yes. Saying whether or not, they're making sure to get both conditions in there. The study described in the article is an observational study, not an experiment. This is because the researchers merely tracked the individuals by analyzing their medical histories. An experiment would need to impose a treatment on the subjects. e.g. assigning them to smoke or not to smoke, which this study did not do, making it an observational study. Yes, they checked all the boxes there. Exercise could be a confounding variable, as those who exercise regularly may not be as at risk for Alzheimer's disease. Additionally, smokers may be more likely to not have regular weekly exercise compared to non-smokers. Therefore, the observed association is unknown to have produced a result of smoking, is unknown to have been produced as a result of smoking or a lack of weekly exercise, making exercise status a potentially confounding variable. Did they make a relationship to both the explanatory and the response? Yes. They received essentially correct on all 3 sections, and so they scored a 4 out of 4 on this one. Tomorrow is the only in-class day that I have to answer questions you guys have on the test review. Does anybody in here need a copy of the test review? All right. You're welcome. So test is on Thursday. I won't see you guys on Wednesday. Please make sure you look over the review thoroughly tonight. Work through as much of it as you can so that I can answer any questions you guys have about that tomorrow in class. Wednesday, you'll have an independent day. I will have my answer key posted so that you can use that to help you study from. And then Thursday, we'll take your test.